is the last figure in our study of 6 great men. And again, we could have done a 100 great men series. There are so many that I would have liked to include it in this, but didn't. Driving in this morning, I'm listening to ESPN, and they're asking one of their guests, who do you say are the top 5 quarterbacks of all time? And, they go through, and then he says, but I make so-and-so 5A and so-and-so 5B. And they said, no, you only get 5. He said, but you didn't include this guy, and you didn't include that. Yeah, they didn't make the cut. Well, they would have made my cut. Well, it's kind of like that when you're talking about the 6 great men of Christian history. There are obviously hundreds, but I've chosen some who represent a variety of times and places and occupations, and their emphasis and the impact that they had. C.S. Lewis, it's interesting to note, is a man who died in November of 1963, but his influence now is as great as it ever was. You're, of course, aware of the not just the Narnia Chronicles, the stories that C.S. Lewis wrote, the books that your children have probably read, you probably have read, but also the monster Hollywood movies that have been produced and just keep going. My own kids watch the BBC versions of those growing up. I read to them some of the Narnia Chronicles, and all of my children plowed through all of those books. They loved them. And by the way, I didn't introduce Christopher. Christopher, stand for just a moment. My son Christopher, who is also a part of our staff, and by the way, who does the research for this series. So he's listening very critically to see if I get it all right. But Christopher graduates on Saturday from Stanford University. So he is... So Lori and I are very proud of Christopher and the fine young man that he is, and we're glad he's going to be joining our staff full time to help his dad with a lot of things that I have going on. So anyway, what cracks me up, by the way, about Christopher's research is Christopher plows through whole books, and I'm like, Christopher, I'm only speaking on this for 45 minutes, son. Give me. And I know most of these guys pretty well. But he has taken so seriously the research that really I should probably go sit down over there and eat a biscuit and let him come up here and tell you about them, because he knows about them a great deal more than I do. Lewis's influence is of course massive, and his influence is so huge because Lewis understood, he touched on something very powerful and important. And that is that one can reach perhaps a much broader audience, not just broader in the sense of numerically, but demographically, if you use the imagination as a vehicle, a platform for theology. In other words, Lewis wrote nonfiction. Many of you have probably read some of Lewis's nonfiction, not as broadly read. His nonfiction. Most works of nonfiction are not. I might write a book on 50 reasons why you should believe in Jesus Christ and sell perhaps 50 copies if my mom buys 10 and my wife the other 40. But story has the power to draw people in, because they're not coming so much in search for theology or truth per se. They're coming for entertainment. They're coming for something that is appealing and interesting. And Lewis realized that this could be the vehicle through which truth is about the Christian faith is itself conveyed. And the result, of course, was that he reached audiences both young and old, and his influence just keeps perpetuating itself. You see now, for instance, with books like The Golden Compass and so forth, atheists have now landed upon and realized Lewis was on to something and have tried themselves to do this. I recall attending a lecture at Oxford University by a very learned man who was working then on a biography since been published of C.S. Lewis, but he said this, and I immediately thought, no, you're wrong. He said Lewis was really among the first, George MacDonald before him, to use the imagination as a vehicle for conveying truth. And I thought, I'm sure we could probably go back further, but my immediate thought was, no. I mean, Dante did it with the Inferno. Victor Hugo did it with Les Mis. Dostoevsky did it with the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. There have been many who have done this and who have done it for a very long time. John Milton with Paradise Lost. These were all people that Lewis had read. But Lewis himself makes a discovery of his own, which we will get to here in just a moment. Lewis was born in November of 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. That's interesting because this is also where a man by the name of John Lennox is from, who, by the way, had C.S. Lewis as a professor at Cambridge University. And I think it's interesting. One time John and I were going to a local church, and as we're driving there, I'm telling him, because we're going from place to place, and I'm telling him a little bit about the church, and I'm telling him what he might talk about. And, he said, do you think they would be interested in C.S. Lewis? This is when I first met John. And I said, I think so. I said, a lot of people here have read C.S. Lewis. He's very well known. He said, I had Lewis as a professor. Do you think that would interest them? I said, I think it would, John. I think it would. But it's so funny because he was very casual about it and kind of thought, I don't know. I said, I think that's worth mentioning. And John says that Lewis, he says this was, I think it was like 1961 or 62. Lewis was in decline and, of course, died in 63. But he said that Lewis would enter into the room. He says, coming in Oxford, he walked to and from the university. Most of his career was spent at Oxford. But at this point, he's at Cambridge. And he said that he would walk into the room, students would all be sitting, and he would begin taking off his scarf, which was wrapped around his neck. And he said the moment he stepped through the door, he would begin lecturing. And he would walk to the front, unfurling this scarf and taking his jacket off and putting it on a coat hanger. He would lecture. And as he's watching the clock and it's time to conclude, he takes his jacket, he puts it on, and he starts putting the scarf on and keeps talking and walks straight out the door. He said this is the way Lewis operated. But Lewis was a man who was not always a Christian. He was a man who indeed for a time considered himself to be an atheist, and he calls himself a reluctant convert, that he didn't want to become a Christian. But he said that God was hard on his heels and was pursuing him. Lewis, as a child, his primary playmate was his older brother Jack. Jack was 3 years older, and the two of them, not Jack, Warren. Lewis, by the way, was known as Jack. He's as a child, you wonder, how do you get from Clive Stapleton Lewis, Jack? You probably very well know that his brother called him Jack and other intimates called him Jack. How do you get that out of that? Well, as a child, he declared to his parents, "My name is Jack." They're like, "Well, actually, it isn't, but okay." And so they called him Jack, and that stuck. That became his name with intimates throughout the rest of his life. And Warren was his best friend, and the two of them created their own imaginary worlds, and they wrote about them, and they used, I guess, the equivalent of play figures and so forth to create this imaginary world. And Lewis would later say that the origins of Narnia were in his childhood, the world that he and Warren had created. It was while he was yet a child, he was only 10 years old, that his mother, Flora, who had been ill for quite some time, that she died. And this had a profound influence on Lewis's life. Lewis says, and he describes his father as a very loving father, but that his father lacked the ability to communicate that to his children. He said that we were like, ambassadors of foreign powers interacting with my father, who tried very hard to have a kind of intimacy and relationship with us that he said that we were never able to bridge that gap. And he said, because the translator of my relationship with my father was always my mother. She was the one who brought nurture. This is typical in a lot of families, actually. She was the nurturer. She was the one who knew how to interact with us, to encourage us, and to love us the way the way a child wants to be loved and longs to be loved. And after she died, we slowly drifted apart from my father. And I think Lewis always felt that. Lewis's father certainly felt that and seems to have been greatly bothered by the fact, and yet neither side was ever really able to breach this. Albert Lewis, C.S. Lewis's father, we're told, would come home from work and would walk hands behind his back around the garden with his boys, this was his intimate time with them, as they walked around a bit and conversed, and then kind of formally, well, okay, very well, and you kind of do your thing, and now I do mine. There's something very sad in this picture of a father who loves, who adores his children, and who longs to reach them emotionally, but is himself, Lewis said, what I didn't realize at the time is my father was reeling and wounded from the loss of his wife. He was suffering, and so were we. And we suffered separately, and we grew apart. The death of Lewis's mother, he says, was catastrophic to his family. And yet, it was Albert who took a special interest in Jack Lewis's education and sought to choose for him proper boarding schools and places where he might go to be best prepared. And this was, by the way, very common at this time. You sent your kids off to boarding school, which I'm not a big fan of, but in this day and age, it was deemed to be the only hope of your child eventually attaining any kind of hope for proper university education and therefore a career. So Lewis headed off to boarding school, and he went to a variety of boarding schools where it seems that his experiences were a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the boarding schools he describes as, some of the experiences he describes as very intellectually stimulating, and where he developed friendships and relationships, and yet others where he speaks of rampant homosexuality and so forth. This is very interesting because right now I'm working on a book on my relationship with Christopher Hitchens for HarperCollins. And Hitchens went off to boarding school, very typical, Winston Churchill like this, C.S. Lewis like this, and they all speak of quote unquote buggery, that is to say, homosexuality, male homosexuality that was often prevalent in English prep schools at this time. Lewis says that it was never a temptation for him, but it deeply disturbed him, the knowledge of these things that were taking place in his schools. Now, Warren would later say that he felt that Jack exaggerated the degree to which this was prevalent, and this became actually a point of contention between the two of them, because in Surprised by Joy, Lewis's book, Lewis talks about this, and Warren is of the opinion, it wasn't nearly as bad as that. You completely exaggerate that, and Lewis took exception to Warren's exception of his characterization of things there. But it nonetheless is interesting because some would characterize Lewis as very prim, and that he was of a mentality that when it came to sexuality, that he just kind of had this distance from it and didn't understand it. If you read what Lewis wrote about sex, I would suggest to you that Lewis was anything but prim. Lewis speaks very, very plainly about issues ranging from homosexuality and masturbation and all the way to intimate love with one's spouse. He spoke of it very plainly in a way that, quite honestly, when I read Lewis, I find myself going, I feel like I'm the prim one. I'm a little embarrassed by some of it. So I don't see that in Lewis, but nonetheless, some did. Lewis would eventually receive a scholarship. His only hope of going to university was if he could attain a scholarship, and a tutor who specially prepared him for these exams got him ready. And Lewis did exceptionally well on his entrance exams. He earned a scholarship to Magdalen College. It looks like Magdalen College, but Magdalen College is one of the real prestigious colleges at Oxford University, and it is where Lewis himself went, and he studied classical literature there. He ended up, World War I began, and he ended up joining, as many Oxford students did. I had a great uncle who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, who at this time, like Lewis, went and joined the military and was killed somewhere in Flanders, just blown to pieces. Lewis saw these kinds of events obviously quite frequently. He was at the Somme, for instance, one of those bloody episodes in the history of warfare. And Lewis would write of some of his experiences there later. But while he was there, one of his very dear friends, a man by the name of Paddy Moore, they had made a promise to one another that whoever it was who survived, that the other would look after his parents. And in the case in this particular case, Paddy Moore was killed, and Lewis kept his promise of looking after his mother. Lewis became very close to her. Some of the biographies of Lewis suggest there was a sexual relationship. To me, this is what's very unfortunate. Often in close relationships, historically speaking, is the assumption is often that there's something seedy really going on. David and Jonathan, what's up with that? Those two couldn't possibly really be that close without something untoward taking place. It goes to show how perverted our culture really is, and how poorly we sometimes understand love, genuine love, appropriate love between men. And please understand me, I don't mean it in a homosexual sense. I mean that a man who loves his friends, his comrades, and who feels an intimacy, a closeness with them. In this case, it seems pretty clear that Lewis took care of Mrs. Moore, because he initially had a promise he was simply seeking to keep, but secondly, because Lewis had a deep longing to replace his mother. And she had a deep longing to replace her son, who was very close. By the way, this is not at all unusual for the time. Frequently, parents who lost children adopted, as it were, boys of roughly the same age as their own children, because they felt a gap in their own life. And here's a boy who is in need of what we have, of a relationship with parents, as it were. And in Lewis's case, he took care of Mrs. Moore until the day she died. For the next, roughly 30 years, he remained very close with her, and he called her his mother. He referred to her as his mother. Warren, it seems, was less thrilled with this relationship probably because he was a little jealous, because he and Jack were very close, and now enters in another relationship of which he was not a part. Lewis himself had been wounded in Flanders, and he was discharged as a result of this. He resumed his university education, and at this time he considered himself an atheist. He ultimately landed a position teaching at Magdalen College, where he was teaching English. And Lewis was beginning a career in writing. And by the 1920s, he had joined a little group of like-minded, almost, scholars and writers who called themselves, does anyone know? The Inklings. The Inklings. And this is a group of very famous, very famous writers, who included among their number Tolkien. And Tolkien, who was Catholic, Tolkien, who was unquestionably a Christian, began to have a profound influence on Lewis's life. And Lewis would say that he resisted the idea of God. And then he went for long walks and talks with Tolkien, who was the older man, who also had fought in World War I, and who spoke also of his own horrific experiences there, but who was also a professor of literature. And his influence on Lewis became rather profound. They met at a place called the Eagle and Child. If I've taken groups there. The Eagle and Child is now kind of a smoky kids hangout. And the irony is I don't think any of the Oxford students who hang there now have any idea that this is where the Inklings were. If you were to go in there tonight, let's say, you would find that, again, it's just a bar with mostly of students, and you're kind of trying to fight your way through the haze that hangs in the place. But in the back room, you'll discover a picture on the wall that's rather, it's not really celebrated or, with ribbons around it or big plaques, but there's a picture of the Inklings. This was the place where they gathered and when they read to each other their own literature. And they critiqued what the other was writing and smoked their pipes and enjoyed a beer before they walked home. And Lewis enjoyed this interaction. When the end of the day of teaching was over, they would make their way to the Eagle and Child and other places where they would share with each other what they're thinking. And they would really critique each other and seek to prompt one another's thinking. And it's during these discussions that Lewis was challenged in his unbelief. And this is what Lewis had to say. He said, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen College," that is, at this point, where he lived, "night after night feeling, whenever my mind was lifted, even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him," with a capital H, "whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." But it is at that point that Lewis himself would speak of this occasion as, he converts to theism at this point, not to Christianity as such. But then he writes this in 1931, September of 1931. Hugo Dyson, who was one of the Inklings, he says that he, Dyson, stayed the night with me in college, and Tolkien came too and did not leave until 3 in the morning. We began in Addison's Walk just after dinner on metaphor and myth. This is what they were discussing. Interrupted by a rush of wind that came so sudden on that still warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We continued on Christianity, a good, long, satisfying talk in which I learned a lot. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met with the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. And again, if I met with the idea of God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much, provided I met it anywhere except the Gospels. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, is what Tolkien said. A myth working on us in the same way as others, but with tremendous difference in that it really did happen. Does this amount to belief in Christianity? At any rate, I am now certain that the Christian story is to be approached in a sense as I approach other myths, and that it is the most important and full of meaning. I'm also nearly sure that it actually happened. So Lewis, in his discussions with Tolkien, they're talking about myth, which they were both fascinated with as professors of literature, because it's in mythology that all the great literature has its beginning, Beowulf and so forth. And they were fascinated with myth. And does myth have in and of itself any kind of truth? You may recall the line in The Lord of the Rings where it says, and history became myth, and myth became legend. That is the idea that there is in mythology a grain of truth, that perhaps these stories, there's some kind of reality that sits behind them. And Tolkien's approach to sharing the gospel with Lewis was to say, Jack, you're happy with mythology, provided it's not what you're reading in the Bible. So try this on. Read it as you would any other bit of literature and see what you think of it. And Lewis, in reading it, concludes this doesn't read like mythology. And meaning his understanding of myth is that myth is a story that's not true. And Tolkien's response was who spoke of it slightly differently, said, oh, but it is a myth, and it is true. And so Lewis would seize upon this phrase that Christianity is a true myth, but that the idea that God prepares the soil of the heart, so to speak, with mythologies, stories of resurrection, stories of gods, and so forth, that this is a means of preparing our heart for the true myth. And so you don't mind encountering stories of gods and resurrections and whatnot elsewhere. What is it about the Christian faith that makes you so mad? Why can't you enjoy this story? And Lewis says that he finally gave in to this line of reasoning. And he tells the story, it's referred to sometimes as the sidecar conversion. He and Jack were on their way into town. Jack's driving the motorcycle. He's sitting in the sidecar. And he said, when we left the house, I did not believe that Christianity was true. And by the time we arrived, I did believe that it was true. So somewhere along the line, he says that this was his conversion. And he refers to himself as a reluctant convert. That he said that I was running from God, but God was hard on my heels. And I could not escape from him. He slowly broke me down. Now, Lewis at this point, he having become a Christian, he now seeks to promote his Christian faith. He now seeks to become a defender of Christian belief. And it's because he's come out of in his own life, he recognizes who he had been in his atheism and all of his objections to the Christian faith. And now he begins writing and speaking and addressing the very objections that he raised. And he begins to see a kind of absurdity in his own logical arguments against the Christian faith. And so Lewis begins writing on Christianity, and it's with a book called, I think it's Out of the Silent Planet, isn't that right, Christopher? He writes Out of the Silent Planet, and he smuggles the Christian faith into that particular work of fiction. It's science fiction, if you haven't read it. I had to read it as a freshman in college, and it's actually my least favorite of his works. But in writing Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis smuggles Christianity into the story, and it was pretty well received and reviewed. And Lewis couldn't help but notice that only 2 of the many reviewers even recognized that Christian theology permeated the book. And this became an encouragement to him, because he realized this is a means through which Christian truth can be conveyed. And so Lewis began working much more in earnest and deliberately in doing this very thing. Now, Lewis and Tolkien, there's a difference in their philosophy, and we could spend an awful lot of time talking about that, and we don't have the time for that. But Tolkien never liked the Narnia series, which Lewis wrote in the 1950s, actually. Tolkien never liked them. Tolkien didn't like how obvious Lewis was. Aslan, Jesus, his death, resurrection, Lewis didn't like that it felt that the parallels seemed so obvious, and he was a critic, at least privately, to Lewis of that particular work, and it was hugely discouraging to Lewis. Fortunately, there were others who kept saying to him, "Keep going, Jack. This is pretty good." Tolkien might have demolished that whole series because his influence on Lewis was so strong, and Lewis's respect for Tolkien was so high that he nearly gave up the project. But with the encouragement of others, he decided to continue on. Tolkien was of a view, and Lewis himself would say something fairly similar, but there are obvious differences, that you don't set out to convey Christian truth. You just write and you tell the story, and if you're a Christian, it's going to come through. You just can't help it. We'll call it a kind of natural theology, that it sort of permeates your work. Christian truth will come through it because you are a Christian. You can't help but put those things in. Now, Lewis would forever deny, and I think this is true, that he set out, he says, people will say that I did demographic studies of children, and that I then, what it is that they like, and that I then, had a series of Christian truths that I wanted, doctrines that I wanted to convey. And then I took select characters from Scripture, and then I created a fantasy world equivalent. He said, I didn't do that. I created a story, I built on a story that Warren and I had created in our childhood, and this became Narnia. But I think Lewis, in saying that, is only speaking in half-truths, meaning that might be a statement that would be pleasing to Tolkien, to hear him describe his process that way. But it seems fairly obvious that Lewis is seeking to convey certain doctrines, certain spiritual truths, and they're conveyed very powerfully, chiefly through the figure of Aslan, and in this alternate universe that one accesses through a wardrobe. Lewis landed upon this by actually doing studies of children, but not maybe in the formal sense. During World War II, children were being shipped out of London, and he agreed to take into his own home children. And he himself admits, I didn't understand them initially. But after a while, I entered into their world, and I began to understand how they process and how they think, and their fears, their hopes, their dreams. And it was through that Lewis begins to create a world, Narnia, which is designed to reach kids just like the ones in his own house. Now, Tolkien, again, very differently, Tolkien said of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he wasn't writing that for children. Now, I'm fascinated by the fact that he ended up reaching them. My kids loved the Tolkien. I don't know about your kids. My kids loved the Tolkien series. I mean, just demolished them. If I had said to them, hey, these are wonderful Christian texts of theology, I mean, not a chance. They read them because they loved them. And I think this is also funny. My kids early on had such strong opinions about Harry Potter. Having read Tolkien, they were just like, this is crap. I'm not reading this. I don't want to read this. This isn't as good as what Tolkien has written. And Tolkien's stories are infused with Christian. I mean, I found myself sitting, because I hadn't read them, fascinated with with what my children took away from reading Tolkien in terms of Christian truth. Tolkien himself might have been fascinated because he said that he wasn't interested in writing for children. He didn't want to write for children. He said, I don't want to write for those who do not understand adult language. Well, a lot of kids do understand adult language and understand it very well and read those stories. Lewis wrote Narnia for children, but ended up reaching adults, just as Tolkien wrote for adults and reached children, and did so very powerfully. Lewis also did quite a bit of writing of nonfiction. In his writing of nonfiction, I've actually read more of his nonfiction than I have his works of fiction. Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed, The Four Loves. These are all things that Lewis himself wrote, in which he sought to convey in language, the vernacular, in the language of the common man, Christian truth and ideas. And you could call him a bit of Lewis himself would never claim to be a theologian, and he most definitely was not. But he was kind of a Christian philosopher. He was quite good at taking Christian truths and putting them down at a level that ordinary people could access them and indeed find them quite fascinating and interesting. Mere Christianity of his nonfiction works is by far his most influential, and it is Mere Christianity that actually was a series of lectures that Lewis gave, both on the radio and in person, that Lewis gave to soldiers during World War II. He considered, and if you read Mere Christianity with that in mind, you can see it. because there's an awful lot of reference to his own experiences in World War I. There are numerous references to battle and Christianity as a fighting religion and things of this nature. It permeates that particular work. But he had been asked by BBC to do a series of radio broadcasts, and those broadcasts became massively popular. And it led to the conversion of quite a few people. And Lewis was quite open in saying that he hoped through his own writings and through his own addresses that it would lead to an evangelization of Britain. Something that I think always bothered Lewis was that there were those who were great critics of him in the academic world and said he wasn't a serious academic because he wrote stories for children. Lewis need not have worried. We don't remember who any of the critics were. We remember Lewis. We remember Lewis. But in the academic world, people in this kind of serious academic world are very sensitive to that kind of critique. I will reference John Lennox again, but I recall his first book, which is titled God's Undertaker, A Science Buried God. That is, some of you have read it or tried. That book is dense, it is very scientific, and I remember saying to John, you need to bring this down, and he said, I can't. He says, and I realized that John was thinking in his mind of guys who might read it, like a Dawkins or like a Hawking, and that if he wrote for the common man, they would say, well, this isn't science. They would just completely dismiss that. When he wrote his book, 7 Days That Divide the World, I helped John a lot with that book. And I said, John, this may be your most enduring work. You need to keep bringing it down. And he would send me chapter after chapter, and I would keep sending it back saying, no, no, no. No one but an academic will understand what you've written here. Put that in an appendices, save it for another book. Explain the Genesis account of creation and the science in a way that Sally, your wife, would want to pick up and read. She's not an academic, intelligent woman, not an academic, and is going to be bored to tears with something that's too academic. Lewis would continue to produce things on the academic side, but fortunately he didn't lose sight of the fact that he was trying to reach a broader audience. And as I say, we don't remember the critics. We do remember Lewis, but it was some of this that led Lewis to leave his chair at Oxford University and go to Cambridge, where he felt that this was a bit more welcome. Lewis's influence, of course, is so huge primarily because of these kinds of works. It's not the academic ones. Same, by the way, with Tolkien. Tolkien, you probably have to order it. You probably couldn't get it at a bookstore because I doubt they carry it because no one wants it. But Tolkien's academic works they exist, and they're rather dense and difficult reading. That's not the stuff that has endured. It's been that bit that is on the imagination that has had such a profound influence on generations of adults and children. Lewis eventually meets a woman by the name of Joy Davidman. If you've seen Shadowlands touches on this somewhat truthfully, but not entirely. This relationship has been criticized and revered alternately since her death in 1960. Some portray her, Alistair McGrath, portrays her as this brash, vulgar New York, formerly Jewish woman who was a convert to Christianity, who was a gold digger, and who came looking for Lewis to seduce him and to win him over. And this is the way she comes off. Others say that portrayal of her is not at all fair. That yes, she was a brash and probably by Southern and perhaps even genteel English standards, somewhat vulgar by our own standards, but that this was a woman who was accomplished in her own right, who had a miserable marriage to a man who was abusive, and who divorced her, who ran around, and she came to England to seek Lewis out because the two had been corresponding, and she had read his books. She was an accomplished author in her own right, and he had been advising her in her relationship. She came to visit him at Oxford. She ended up getting a job there, I think, as a typesetter or something. And when she was, I guess it would be her visa, ran out, she was going to have to leave the country, and Lewis married her in a civil ceremony. Lewis says that he did this, that love did not factor into it, hence the reason it was a civil ceremony, to prevent her from being forced to leave the country. He supported her and her son out of his own means, and Lewis did this actually for quite a few people, not just for her. And when she was diagnosed with cancer, incurable, Lewis married her in an ecclesiastical, a religious ceremony, and Lewis came to have a very deep love for her. I don't think that really can be questioned, and I'm not really up for questioning a man's love for his wife. And I really see in Lewis that these are, those who are close to him say these were Lewis's happiest years with Joy Davidman. And she was also a kind of editor and so forth for a brief period of time. I think we're talking about like we're really talking about 58, 59, 60, before her death in 1960. And that relationship has, I think Deborah Winger maybe plays the part in Shadowlands, but Lewis was devastated by her death in 1960. And here you see a profound transition in Lewis's nonfiction writings, because he wrote a fairly academic work called The Problem of Pain early on. Basically, sitting as a scholar and saying, well, here's what the Bible says about pain. Read The Problem of Pain and then pick up A Grief Observed. This is a man who is suffering. He's not simply on the outside looking at someone else's pain and explaining in academic terms, let me explain to you what's happening to you. Lewis, in the midst of pain, A Grief Observed is a completely different book. This is a book about how God uses pain and what pain represents in our lives as Christians. The difference in the books is profound. It's me explaining to you as you're dying how you should process this. The other side is me dying, and now I'm processing it all very differently. Lewis himself didn't want his own death to be particularly observed or celebrated, and as it was, it wasn't. He died November 22nd of 1963, which is a day when what else happened? JFK was assassinated. Also, Aldous Huxley died the same day. As a result, Lewis's death was really hidden in the back pages, chiefly because of Kennedy, not so much because of Huxley, but nonetheless, these three very prominent figures died at the same time. Huxley, of course, is famous for Brave New World and was an atheist philosopher. And so Lewis's death was observed by only a small gathering of people, which is what Lewis would want. In Oxford, you can still go and see his house, which is privately owned, and it just sits in a little quaint neighborhood. It's interesting going through Lewis's house because the carpet, he and Jack smoked their pipes, and they would bang out the old tobacco and crush it into the carpet on the floor. I mean, you talk about a house that just looks like a bachelor pad. It was clear that they liked their beer and that they liked their pipes. And the place just reeks of testosterone. I mean, it just doesn't feel remotely feminine at all. The two of them enjoyed their writing, they enjoyed their books, they enjoyed their walks. And the house is more or less maintained as it once was. I believe it's owned by someone at Wheaton, or maybe even Wheaton College itself, I'm not sure. And you can take the walk from his house, into Oxford, which he did on a daily basis. C.S. Lewis is perhaps as famous, maybe more so now than he ever was. And again, I attribute this to the fact that Lewis's writings are so accessible to ordinary people. If you've not read a book by C.S. Lewis, do. Start with Mere Christianity. It's small. It's a very small book. I'm just going to guess, but I'll say 100 pages, if that. I've always believed that Lewis, though I cannot find anything that in our research that shows a direct connection, I am positive that Lewis was profoundly influenced by G.K. Chesterton more than anyone else. If you read Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton, you feel like you're listening to C.S. Lewis. Indeed, the paradigm which Lewis is famous for, the little liar, lunatic Lord, you know what I'm talking about? That Jesus was either a liar, he was a lunatic, or he was Lord. Chesterton uses something very similar to that, and I feel certain Lewis was familiar with that. Gentlemen, it's been a great series. I've enjoyed it, enjoyed seeing